I would like to thank you for your very warm welcome this evening and to say how honoured I am to be able to be speaking to you about your wall paintings and about their wider context. This is, as it were, an introductory lecture. There are many more things that I think wait to be discovered about your paintings and about all of the context in which they sit. But we're here tonight in the beautifully illuminated interior, and we're going to start by thinking about these multiple contexts and the different ways in which we can understand the paintings. Context is a slippery word. Art historians like to talk about the history, the liturgy, the literature, the iconography. What I hope I will do this evening is show you how different elements of context help us to understand different paintings that we are looking at here. One of the things that Leslie mentioned was that I studied at the Courtauld, and my tutor was David Park. Now, David Park had a saying, you should never use a bad slide to make a good point. Those of you who do illustrated lectures will understand this saying. I'm afraid that one or two of my pictures of your paintings are much less clear than the paintings themselves are. So please regard these as reference pictures, and you'll see that I have also made free with pictures. They may be pictures which you yourselves have taken. I've made free with some other pictures so that we have some good visual comparative material here this evening. I'm going to start by talking about the scheme which we see in the spandrels coming down the arcade on this side. When we think about how these paintings were originally, they would be strong, they would be bright. The colours that we can see from the pigments which survive are, broadly speaking, earth colours. When we talk about paintings in medieval churches in England, these are very rarely what we would call fresco paintings, so rarely painted while the plaster is fresh. That's all that fresco means. They're painted on dry plaster, secco, to be technical about it, and they are, if you want to think of it like this, they are vertical archaeology. So you have layer upon layer upon layer, and as you can imagine, there are certain moments when you might expect to see a new scheme of painting. So you might expect to find a new scheme of painting at the end of a building scheme, or a piece of renovation, or at a moment of particular patronage and investment in the church interior. I know that my colleague, Dr. Ellie Pridgeon, has spoken to you, and I know that she will have spoken about her specialism, the paintings of St Christopher. And you'll see a couple of her slides that she's allowing me to use tonight. So I'm not going to talk in particular about the remains of your St Christopher painting, but it is a painting which relates to, up there, it is a painting which relates to one of the themes that we're going to talk about, which is the mapping of space, the articulation of space within the church interior. But the sense of how complicated the idea of context is introduced to us by the scheme that we find particularly in these spandrels going down the north arcade, these images of the lower half of figures. The renewal of the upper part of the wall, the insertion of the clerestory, means we only have the lower halves of these figures. But one of the things that I hope you will take away from this evening, and which you will use to show off to all your friends, is that we can fairly clearly identify the subject of these paintings because these figures all have bare feet. In medieval art, it's the apostles, the disciples, who are repeatedly shown with bare feet. not only them, sometimes angels have bare feet, but when we have these multiple figures wearing long, simple gowns and mantling over the top with bare feet, we are looking at a scheme of the apostles. And given the number of surviving elements that we have, I think we're talking about a full set. So 12 apostles surrounding you, embracing you here in the nave of the church. And there are a variety of ways in which we can think about what that might have meant for a medieval congregation to worship surrounded by these large standing figures of the apostles. There's an image which is often used in thinking about the interpretation of early Christian mosaics, which I think is also helpful for us when we think about these particular wall paintings, which is that we, the people in the building, are in a sense the lowest layer of this painted scheme. We are the living figures here, and then we have these large holy figures above us in their various tiers. But just to give you a sense of the range of types of meanings, of context we might draw on when we try to think about these figures of the apostles, this is a picture whose full identity, again, it's David Park really discovered. So it's Little Easton in Essex. It's a Romanesque painting, a seated figure, an apostle, and you can see this very strong clasped hand gesture. Isn't very clear to see from this picture, but in that hand there is the remains of the form of a cross. And beneath the feet of the figure there is this little silhouette, effectively vignette, a stylized image of someone pruning vines. So this is the labour of the month associated with our month, March. And the fact that we have this seated figure and one of a set of 12 labours of the month suggests to us very strongly that we have 12 apostles. This is the only part of this 12th century scheme which is currently visible at Little Easton. The cross in the hands of the apostle suggests that what we have here is the working out of the idea that the consecration crosses around the church, so the 12 crosses which had oil applied to them in the consecration of a church by the presiding bishop, that those 12 crosses were shown in this scheme held by the figures of the apostles. Those of you who know the extraordinary and beautiful interior at Saint-Chapelle in Paris will know that there you have statues of the 12 apostles holding clipius roundels with the consecration cross forms in them. So maybe this is to do with the sacredness of this space, the consecration of this space. This is a chancel at Kingston, a scheme from the very end of the 13th or early 14th century. On a fictive pedestal here, we have a standing figure of an apostle, probably St James. And it looks as if there, perhaps, when that chancel was rebuilt, such a scheme was installed. I want you here, we've got a central figure of St Christopher. These are paintings at Brisley in Norfolk from the second half of the 14th century. Two figures on either side. Don't worry if you can't see very much yet. That's alongside the drawing from the late 1920s. But to really see what these figures were, we have to go back to this antiquarian image. I hope you can see, particularly on the left-hand side, just as we had at Kingston, the figures are standing on pedestals. So they are two-dimensional mural paintings imitating a much more ambitious scheme, a sculptural scheme, as I say, like the famous one at Saint-Chapelle, of the apostles around the church. Once we move into the 14th century, this imagery of the apostles with its primary liturgical meaning is, as it were, hijacked by the great campaign of lay education and the use of vernacular literature, sermons, plays and paintings and stained glass for vernacular lay education. teaching people the catechism, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 corporal works of mercy, the creed, the Lord's Prayer. What you start to see in this period, one of the visual schema for presenting this catechetical information is the idea that the Apostles' Creed was written by a committee. So you have the 12 apostles, and they each contribute a statement, a sentence, a tenet. And thus you see them holding these scrolls with the words of the creed on. This is Hales in Norfolk from the mid-14th century on the left. Slightly earlier, Longthorpe Tower. The darkened faces are pigment alteration. You've got, obviously there's a slight problem because we've only got 11 of the 12 original disciples, apostles, involved in the time of the early church. So in this instance, that 12th place is taken by a personification of the church herself, Mother Church, or Ecclesia. That's the female figure with the veiled head you see there on the left. And this becomes a very popular scheme, for example, on East Anglian rood screens. And it's also similarly very popular in 14th and 15th century stained glass. 12 apostles with the words of the creed. So you can see how a schema such as the Apostles, it might have a liturgical meaning, it might be something which forms that sense of sacred space, or it might be much more of a didactic programme. We're going to think now about space and time and the doom painting. You will all be familiar with the idea that the doom painting is very frequently found on the nave east wall, and in most churches that is also the transition between the nave and the chancel. And it is the place where you have your rood cross, the image of Christ crucified, the Virgin on the left, St John on the right, displayed. The doom painting manipulates our sense of both space and time. Writing at the end of the 14th century, John Merck, the preacher from Lilleshall in Shropshire, talked about how Christ will come out of the east to judge the quick and the dead. So where this image is enacting the final judgment, enacting the direction of Christ's arrival, and it establishes certain relationships in the church. So all of you on this side, you're fortunate, you're at Christ's right hand, your eternal destiny is going to be very cheerful. I'm sorry, you on this side, your eternal destiny a little bit less certain in terms of the right and the left. So this is a side associated with saints, with patrons, and because it's the side with the rood and sometimes with intercessory figures of the Virgin Mary, this is the side on which the women would have sat in your church in the Middle Ages if there was a segregation of seating. It doesn't happen in every church, but there's a general practice of segregated seating or standing pre-seating in medieval churches. So the right hand and the left hand, heaven up top, our left, so Christ's right, it's his hands, his side that matters in terms of this. Hell mouth with the great eye and the great gaping mouth, the Leviathan of hell mouth, down there. So you've got that diagonal relationship. When you look east, you're looking into the future. You see the image of Christ, you can see how the head of Christ, the face of Christ, the features of Christ are emphasized. You can see how he is sensed by these 2 flying angels with the little crosses on their heads, and he's flanked on either side by these images of angels carrying instruments of the Passion. So the whip, the sponge for the vinegar, and the pot with the vinegar. He's seated on the rainbow. In terms of the sources of the iconography of the Last Judgment, there are lots of different bits of the Bible which are being drawn on and knitted together in this image. So the general idea, the Last Judgment, the sheep and the goats, the left and the right, that comes from Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. But some of these other details, so for example, the throne of the rainbow, the earth as the footstool, the the monstrous Leviathan burning hell. These come from different bits of scripture. It's an image which is a composite. It's made out of lots of different bits and references. One of the things I want to tell you about wall paintings is if you get a really boring wall painting, so just something decorative, nothing figurative, it usually means there was something really important in front of it in the Middle Ages. For example, this is a drawing of the East End, the area around the Chancel Arch at Preston Park. Can you see in the middle, above that arch, we don't have any figures, we've just got some rather dull foliage, and that's because that's where the rood cross would be. The rood cross would be in front of that. Similarly, in these lower areas, we've got this sort of fictive foliate drapery. Those are aisle altars. So those are where these altars would be. Always look for boring paintings. It tells you where the really important things in a church were. Wall paintings are often ancillary. They interpret, they explain, they teach, they enhance. But the really central liturgical fixtures, altars, statues, those three-dimensional images, those are the primary focus, particularly when we're talking about the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries. And sometimes there can be almost a visual battle or conflict between these two-dimensional images and three-dimensional images. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. This is the engraving of the Doom painting from St Michael's Church in St Albans. It's only that lunette, that half-moon area, which now survives as a piece of painted board. You can't see the rest of the painting. What I hope you can see is, because there was a very large rood cross in that church, the image of Christ in judgment has been rather unceremoniously pushed to one side. So rather than being dominant and central and symmetrical, as your image is, the image is here on this side. You can see heaven and hell, as in your painting, the hell mouth in this personified way. You can see pleading figures of the Virgin and St John the Baptist, so these interceding figures, and you can see there is a picture of an alewife being carried off into hell. She's been given a piggyback by a demon, and her ale pot with which she cheated her customers, giving them bad ale and short measures, is going off into hell with her. So that your Doom painting is quite interesting because there are a number of things which we don't easily see in it. It doesn't seem to have this pillaring of particular sinners. It doesn't seem to focus on this idea of the apostles forming a sort of heavenly jury of 12 good men and true. It's not got all the busyness and complication of a typical late medieval Doom painting. Rather, it's rather more like the sort of representation of the Last Judgment you would find in a Psalter or a Book of Hours. It's more like a devotional depiction, very much focused on, Christ, his wounds, his passion, heaven and hell. And when you think about the Doom painting and the cross being shown together, there's a tension there. The cross says, there is mercy, there is forgiveness. You should repent because you will be forgiven. The church has a confessional system which will enable your sins to be washed away, your soul to be saved. The Last Judgment says there will be a point where time is called. You will run out of time. You should live in awareness of the Last Judgment. So those two images work in tension with each other. And this picture creates these ideas of time and space within the church. We're now going to look at the area in your north aisle. So around the east end of the north aisle, we've got these two tiers of paintings, large figures, showing a continuous cycle of scenes of the Passion. This is the image of that main area between the two windows. In the upper area, we've got the outline of an image of the Last Supper, and then we've got the arrest of Christ and the buffeting of Christ going round on the top. In the lower zone, we have this large, wide, expansive picture of the crucifixion, and then we have a picture of the entombment and the resurrection. Now, this material that I'm going to share here is just from VCH Hertfordshire. I'm sure it will be very familiar to you all, but it's helpful in terms of us trying to think about some dates. In 1332, William de la Zouche gets a license to found a chantry chapel for 2 years. And when this is dissolved at the time of the Reformation, it's assumed that this seems to have been a co-work between the lord of the manor and the parson. We hear about it in 1410, associated with the Earl of Warwick, and this obviously becomes known as the Beauchamp Chapel, or Beauchamp Chantry, but the foundation is in the 1330s, and I think that is helpful in terms of us thinking about this scheme. It's quite unusual for us to have painted schemes which we can connect with documentation of any sort, particularly documentation of the foundation of a chapel, whether it's a chantry license or a gift in a will. This is a rare example from Corby Glen in Lincolnshire. We have the will of a lady, Marjorie de Creole, which relates to this chapel in the North Isle, and we have contemporaneous paintings. Maybe Marjorie saw herself as being rather like these images of Anne and her daughter, these holy women united in the act of reading and praying. Marjorie's a woman, she's leaving books and prayer beads in her will. So we perhaps sometimes find a personal selection of images. It's a more private space, it's a more particular space. And there are a range of churches where we no longer have documentation, but we can clearly see these small chapels at the ends of aisles. This is a very battered example from Cold Overton in Leicestershire. You can see there the Piscina and the east wall. You can see there's this same sort of bent ribbon pattern between the scenes that you have here. And I think your painting's a little bit later than this. I will show you why, but I think your paintings are perhaps maybe the later 1330s, probably the 1340s. This is just the detail describing the descent, how the Zouche Chapel becomes the Beauchamp Chapel, how this goes through the family line. It's the inheriting widow, Alice, in her third husband is William de la Zouche. At the same time that they get the license for this chantry in the church, they're also getting the license for a private chapel in their house. So it may be that actually they don't come here very often. They can have their services in the privacy of their own home, but they're present in your church through their chapel. Another location which has paintings of not the same subject but with a similar feel is South Newington in Oxfordshire. Very beautiful saturated paintings, and the reason I'm showing you these as an example, they have the similar scale to your paintings. These two tiers of narrative scenes are quite large. I know the figures are not as large as these figures we've looked at in the area of the nave, but they are quite large. You've not got more than just the two levels. If you look at the style of the paintings, the reason that I'm wanting to push that date, 1330s, maybe, probably 1340s, there's a sort of angularity about the paintings, and there are certain costume details. In the later 1340s, the hemline went up, and you understand I'm talking about the male hemline. So really the late 1340s is when the fashion cycle, as we understand it, the Northern European, Western European fashion cycle with its 10-year trend of fashion start to happen. Some people said this is why the Black Death happened. It was all of this terrible indulgence in fashion. What you can see, though, very often, once we move from the 1320s towards the 1340s, is that the neckline. So the neckline goes from being very circular and scooped to being much broader. And figures become more and more angular. So they've still got that mannered quality, which you find in decorated figure style, but they have this slightly spiky, mannered, gaunt appearance. I'm showing you here, this is probably the most, as it were, modern of the four artists associated with the Neville Hours. Look at these figures, they're sharp elbows, they're big, long hands. When we have these sorts of scenes from the Passion, very often it's possible to find visual analogies and to see the context from which they came. And I'm showing you here, for example, this is Great Tew in Oxfordshire, a church which had very high-level patronage. It had a number of clergy who were also effectively civil servants, high-ranking figures. There's a particular connection in the models that are used there with models that we find in Opus Anglicanum, in contemporary embroidery, which is very much a London-centred thing as far as we can tell. So this is a scene of the flagellation. You can see we have these very strongly characterised, you might say potentially with this figure slightly racially characterised figures. And this is an example of Opus Anglicanum, probably from London, this sort of same date, just a little bit earlier than your paintings. But I hope you can see, when you compare the detail, particularly the figure on the left, that there's clearly a common model between these two. There's a commonality between a model that's being used for embroidery in London and these paintings in Oxfordshire at a church where the patronage is connected with London, connected with the court. I hope you can see now, we're looking at the detail of this picture, what I was saying about those broad necklines, the long hands, the angular quality, particularly evident with his poor Malchus having his ear cut off. He's falling quite dramatically out of the middle of the painting. And you can see, again, also the long faces. It's very typical of the style that we get as we move towards the middle of the 14th century. I'm going to just show you a couple of images from early 14th century illustrated books where we have this subject. You can see they're similarly busy and confused, and the figure of Malchus is similarly this small figure, and the figure of the betrayer coming in. So you have this quite intimate, close, the betraying kiss in the middle of the picture. In this image, we have actually the scene of Peter is following the command to put his sword back in its sheath, and Malchus has had his ear healed already. Whereas, as I say, this is the point where the point where his ear is being mutilated by Peter's sword. I hope you can see that they're not exactly the same, but there's a commonality in a style and in the very busy treatment of the scene. The Delisle Psalter, I think, here helps you to see how this scene would originally have appeared. We've got the cruciform halo here, and we've got a figure in profile on that left-hand side, buffeting the blindfolded figure of Christ. Being shown in profile is not a good sign in medieval wall painting. It's often used, as we've seen, to give characters a particularly exaggerated and grotesque appearance. So this is your scene of the crucifixion. There's been a degree of probably sort of strengthening and retouching around this central figure of Christ. Certainly that's what Tristram felt when he wrote about these paintings. He and posthumously Monica Bardwell wrote about the paintings in the late 40s, early 50s. I'm going to talk about some of the detail that we can see. I just want you to see this is a large scene. We've got one of the thieves crucified here. We've got a figure here whose 2 hands and spear are visible. We've got a figure standing on this side. We've got a figure in armour on this side. I felt that this was quite a good parallel for the angle of the head of Christ in your picture. The way that it's shown out and, and drop down and coming out. So this is a period where you start to see little elements of Northern European borrowing from early Renaissance art, Giotto, Duccio and so on. So you often see little elements where you've got slightly more foreshortening, or you've got slightly more naturalism, modelling of the body. I think this is what we can see in your painting. And as I say, I think this is quite a good parallel for the slightly unusual way in which the head is coming out. Can you see that, how it's sunk beneath the shoulders? And how we've got some anatomical modelling, particularly of the rib cage. I don't know whether originally, I mean, it's a very naked image of Christ, which is interesting. The Romans crucified people naked. It was part of what made it all shameful and disgusting. But the story, particularly associated with Franciscan devotional writing, was that the Virgin Mary took her veil off and wrapped it around her son to preserve his modesty. So all of those devotional paintings of baby Jesus playing with Mary's veil and so on, they all relate to this idea of the Virgin's veil and it being a sign of the crucifixion. If we come down on this side of the picture, you can see that we've got a hand coming up. This might be the figure of St John, or it might be the figure of the centurion. I think maybe the centurion is a bit further out in your picture. You can see here the detail of the spear into the side. And particularly here, this is very, very characteristic. So you see how this, I'm going to do it with my hands, that there's a hand here holding a spear, and there's a hand here pointing back. There. So the spear, this is the piercing of Christ's side. You remember it was the Sabbath, they had to make sure the people were dead and get rid of the bodies. So they go round and they basically hammer in, they break the legs of the people who are still alive. Christ is already dead, so they don't smash his legs in, but they stick a spear into his side just to make good and sure. And the story in the Middle Ages was that this was undertaken by a Jewish figure called Longinus, who was blind, and that the water and the blood described in Scripture, these give him back his sight. So very often you have him shown with his outer eye, I'm not sure I can do this for you, but anyway, his outer eye still closed, signifying his blindness, and his eye facing towards the cross open. And this is why he's pushing in the spear, and he's pointing back with his eye. So that is what you're seeing here, and that's why this figure appears to be, as it were, kneeling down, because it's it's almost a devotional sort of scene, and I think this is the figure of the Virgin Mary standing beyond. Can you see the figure there? That's this figure of Longinus pointing back at his eye, holding the spear. And there you've got the figure of the centurion figure, so the exotic figure pointing up at the cross is brought in front of the figure of John the Divine. So this would have been quite a complex panorama of the crucifixion, with the 3 crosses and this whole cast of characters. So whereas your Doom painting is a blown-up version of a very personal, devotional image, this wall painting, I think, is more like a panel painting or a more panoramic setting of the subject. You can see here that Longinus on the left here is shown as a knight. Again, the gesture pointing back to the eye there. And the John the Divine here, and the centurion. The centurion is doing something quite curious because he's got one hand really close to the cross, the other side of John the Divine. So the centurion is the person who gets to say, you know, surely this was the Son of God, as in the famous joke about John Wayne making the film of the crucifixion, where they said, you need to say it with more awe. And so he says, "Oh, surely this was the Son of God." And then this is a detail where you can see the deposition laying Christ in the tomb. You can see how that's done. So we've got this privileged look of the wounds in Christ's hand. Very common with wall painting that you have later features, doors and tablets coming in the way. But you can see it's this sort of scene, the body in the tomb, the anointing of the body by the figures. So now I'm going to just finish off by talking about the context in relation to your painting of the 3 living and the 3 dead. And this is most recent of the paintings I'm going to talk about today, probably dating from the 1430s, 1440s, datable by its fashion and in its relationship to the clestory. But I think this is an interesting painting because paintings from the 15th century of the 3 living and the 3 dead are relatively unusual. There are over 50 known and recorded paintings of the 3 living and the 3 dead in predominantly parish churches in England. The majority of them are 14th century. So this one is an outlier as a 15th century painting, and it has a particularly interesting and unusual feature. So I'm going to talk you up towards that. But you can see here we've got these skeletal figures, and they confront figures who are out hawking. So up here near the chancel, we've got these 3 figures out hawking, and then we've got the skeletons who they meet. And one of the things that is particularly striking and unusual about your painting is the very sinuous, elegant and twisting pose of the skeletal figures, which I think, tells us something quite interesting about the visual sources that are being used here. A lot of what I've been talking about today, I've been talking about particularly the Bible, about liturgy, and about other devotional texts. The 3 living and the 3 dead is a really interesting subject in terms of the decoration of medieval parish churches, because it is a subject that comes out of vernacular literature from the French court. So secular literature, if you like, although, as we will find, with a memento mori theme. It appears that in the late 13th century there are a number of poets who pretty much simultaneously write poems on this theme of the 3 living and the 3 dead. And you can think about this, if you like, as being a moral story which is presented as if it was, a tale designed to appeal to the elite. So a tale of quest and mystery, a tale of hunting, but it all goes a bit wrong. So on the left-hand side here, I'm sorry about the watermark, but this is just to show you, this is the early representation of the earliest known representation of this subject. So in a French literary manuscript from about the 1280s, you can see we've got the 3 in this case, 3 undifferentiatedly young, elegantly dressed figures with hawks on their hands. So they're hunting after a relatively small quarry. They're hunting on foot, so they're hunting after, hares or rabbits or something like that. And they're confronted by these 3 skeletons who warn them that they must, forsake these, vain, self-pleasuring ways, and they must prepare for death. And you can see that there is a difference between these figures. This is the person who's most recently been buried, so there's a shroud. Here is a figure with sort of less shroud, a little bit more dislocated, and then finally you have quite a desiccated cadaver or sort of bony skeleton figure. These are paintings in a secular context, the beautiful chamber at Longthorpe Tower. The Thorpe family, they were the stewards of Peterborough Abbey. They have this marvellously decorated chamber. You can see that the paintings they've gone black because of pigment alteration. But the pose and the gestures of these 3 figures of the dead are exactly the same as in this French manuscript. There's a very clear visual link between the French secular manuscript form and the way in which this appears in this painting. The probably most famous representation of this subject, it appears just a few times. There are only 4 representations in English manuscript painting, so much more common in mural painting than in manuscripts. But we also sometimes see a connection between the manuscripts and then the way that the scene is painted in parish churches. So this is a development of the image I've just shown you. It's based on that French model but developed. And the particular thing that this artist, the Delal master, does is he adds this scepter. Can you see this scepter here? Now, if you're going hunting and hawking, you don't want to take your scepter. It's going to be a nuisance. It's going to get in the way, unless you're thinking you're going to bop something on the head with your scepter. So it is slightly puzzling why this scepter appears. It doesn't make sense. The French poem describing this outer figure says that he's wringing his hands. So he's meant to be doing this kind of hand-wringing, hand-grinding gesture. He's not meant to be holding a scepter. I think it's possible that this comes in because the Delal master was working at Westminster, painting the images of the kings on the sedilia, some of which still survive. And this idea of the scepter becomes very important in English wall painting of this subject, borrowed directly, as far as I can see, or introduced directly by this figure, the Delal master, and then copied. So this is a set of wall paintings around the tomb of Sir John Boutetou, in Essex, and you can see the scepter is shown there and these same gestures of the figures. As we go through the 14th century, this subject, as it were, spreads out and all sorts of incidental details start to be introduced. So you start to see the detail of rabbits, you start to see the detail of dogs. Sometimes you see the 3 living and the 3 dead on horses. And the other thing that you start to see is this use of the vernacular. If you look at the top here, you've got vernacular words across the top here. This is the only vernacular, the only English in this beautiful illuminated book. And the same in the Tameth Hours, where this subject appears. It's the only Middle English in a whole book of Latin and Anglo-Norman French. So there seems to be something very particular about these little poetic exchanges between the living and the dead, which you find in wall paintings and you find in these manuscripts, but probably being introduced, as it were, from the bottom up, from an already vernacular context. Now, this subject reads from the inside out. So I'm going to read you the slogans, but I'm going to point to the right figures. So it starts with the front king. He says, "I am afeard." The middle king says, "Lo, what I see, look what I see." And then the third one says, "Methinketh it be devil is 3." Oh! As you know, you have to speak to the dead, and they speak back. And the dead speak in rhyme. This seems to be a very common idea across medieval Europe and also in classical and indeed Arabian context, the idea that the dead reply in rhyme. So the dead say, I was well fair, I used to look nice, such shalt thou be, the memento thing, you're going to end up like this. And then finally, for God's love, beware by me. For God's sake, take warning from me. So this is an example of one of these pictures from the end of the 14th century at Raunds. This is one of Ellie's slides showing the three dead here in this barren landscape, contrasted with the figures of the three living, very, very elegantly dressed, landscape full of the rabbits that they're hunting, very green. You can see that the middle figure there, twisting and turning. So, a greater sense of elegance, a sinuous engagement with the international style. There we are, you can see all of the beautiful costume detail and these elegant figures. But the dead, as you've seen, they're still pretty much just standing there in a line, saying their piece. This is one of the figures of the living here. You can see particularly clearly there the hawk. See its beak. You can see his belt, his big baggy sleeves, very height of fashion. But the feature that I was particularly struck by was the treatment of the dead, because I think what we start to see here is the influence of the subject of the Dance of Death, which is a 15th century subject, a subject first, as far as we can tell, painted in the Pardon churchyard, in the cemetery of Les Innocents during the English occupation of Paris, early 15th century, and then copied in the Pardon churchyard of St Paul's Cathedral. So it was this figure that I was particularly struck by, with its crossed legs and its elegant gestures. And I would like to suggest that what we have here is a very interesting early example of the spread of the knowledge of this subject of the Dance of Death. We don't have any English monumental examples as early as your paintings. We've only got these sorts of examples coming out of the manuscript tradition, these works that are created in Paris, particularly during this time of interchange between England and France. We can see how woodcuts spread this subject very broadly at the end of the 15th century, but I think your paintings are an indication of knowledge of this sort of visual subject slightly earlier. So your Three Living and Three Dead, not only does it carry all of that knowledge of a literary context and the context of the idea of memento mori, the idea that it's morally good for you to contemplate your mortality, all of that is here, but you've also, I think, got a visual reference to this new subject, the subject of the Dance of Death. So I hope that has given you a sense of all of these different contexts. We've had liturgy, we've had time and space and the way that the paintings take us through that and map out space. We've had this more exclusive private space with its narrative paintings, which we can compare with the images that we find in books of hours created for rich lay patrons. And then we have this subject taken out of the literature of the French court, but then repurposed and positioned on the walls of a parish church. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. We've taken us on an amazing journey there, and one I suspect that most of us in sitting here this evening didn't suspect would take us so far or so wide. It's been absolutely fascinating. There's loads to think about. And I hope to see a forest of hands go up now with questions. Right.
Yes, the roving mic is on its way.
I just wanted to ask, who were the painters? We know about the builders, but did the painters go round and were handed from church to church? But do we know anything about them?
Sadly, we know relatively little about the painters in this period. We don't have really any documentation which comes from the workshops of the painters themselves. In some places we have the documentation of the people who are paying the painters. So for example, we have documentation of Master Hugh of St Albans, who's the chief painter in charge of the scheme in St Stephen's Chapel at Westminster. So this is a building and painting scheme which spans the period of the Black Death. We can see the impact of the Black Death in that they basically have to press gang artists from all over the place to come and complete this scheme. So you're quite right. These artists, on the whole, these artists are peripatetic. Some of these artists, or at least some of the models they're using, may be artists like the Madonna master, the master of the painting I showed you from the de la Psalter. He seems to be somebody who was a designer working also in panel painting and making designs for the embroidery. So he's somebody working in multiple media. Sometimes, so that place I was showing you, Cold Overton, those paintings, it may be just the jobbing painter painted those paintings, somebody quite local who sometimes was just doing other general jobs. But mostly what I think we have to think about is small groups, workshops, moving about, peripatetic within a region, and occasionally further afield.
There was another hand went up there.
And in contrast to Duccio and Giotto and so on the whole, we don't have many names, and the names we have, they tend to be called John the Painter.
I wonder, within the rigours of the academic world, where is it possible to use modern computer simulation to bring these images more vividly to us?
So obviously there are all sorts of ways in which people have both wanted to do that and tried to do that. So I suppose there are two things related there. First of all, are there ways in which we can see through the layers, or we can enhance what's there? That is quite difficult because of the sorts of materials that are used in the paintings. People have worked on whether with very sensitive scanning of the surface you can find areas of lost painting and so on. But on the whole, you know, a lot of this work is still done by just making windows and looking for areas of pigment. In terms of reconstructing paintings, yes, I mean, you could use, you know, enhanced colour, you could fill in. There are some places, so for example, Little Missenden in Buckinghamshire, and obviously at St Albans Cathedral, you've got the projection of images. So you're using a projection to fill in lost areas of painting, and that works particularly well. You might be able to sort of imagine something like that with your paintings in the North Isle, either high-tech like that or just making artists' impressions. I'm working at the moment with an artist in Essex who's working on an early 15th century Doom painting where he's just drawing a version of it, bringing out all the detail that you can see in a fragmentary form. So this sort of work, sometimes it's done in this, you know, projection, quite using a lot of kit. And sometimes we're still, you know, we've got an artist filling in the gaps.
It's absolutely fascinating. Any more hands? Yes, Edward. I'm sorry.
Yeah, talking about the wall paintings in St Albans that are projected, I mean, that will cost a fortune if we
Yes.
had it here.
Yes, so
It
you
really
don't,
is.
it's not a thing
I
you need to
don't-
do, but
Yeah, don't get too excited about
Yes.
it. And also, you can only do one side because obviously it's more difficult. And also, I mean, it doesn't apply here, but in St Albans, obviously, the wall paintings of the crucifixion that are in the arches above the projected ones are magnificent, but we can't do that, which is a great pity. What I was going to ask before we got on the ticket is that I'm interested that the three men
Yeah.
meeting the skeletons are on the men's side of the church.
yeah.
Is that significant? Are we naughty? Is it the men who are the
Who
I
are
thought
naughty.
I thought you'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Is there any significance on that rather than on the other side?
In the article that myself and Ellie have written about this subject, which is sort of, it's with another layer of readers. It's in a very long process of being checked out for academic publication, being peer-reviewed. The south side, north side, you find both.
Right.
But almost all of these pictures, almost without exception, they are in the nave. So they're in that lay public area of the church. They're in the area of the church near the pulpit. They're in the area of the church you would expect to access and be in. So they tend to be painted alongside big nave subjects, such as St Christopher, such as the Seven Deadly Sins, St George, Seven Corporal Works of Mercy. A pattern, a nave rather than chancel pattern is a clearer pattern than a north side, south side pattern.
Right.
And across the aisle? Yes, I haven't forgotten, Mary.
Yes, thank you very much. I've been thinking about the sort of pedagogic purposes to which these paintings may have been made, and thinking particularly about the three living and the three dead. Just wondering, might there be some, as it were, seasonal dimension to this? If one thinks that it's been suggested that, Christian celebrations of All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, were in part an appropriation of the pagan festival of Samhain. And Samhain was this sort of mid-autumnal celebration of the lives of the departed ancestors, of recently departed loved ones. And it was held at the time of year when it was thought that the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, and it had that seasonal quality to it. So would this image that we have up there, the image of a conversation, as it were, across a divide between the living and the dead, have been accorded, sort of particular significance in terms of preaching and pedagogy at the time of All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day?
It's a really interesting idea. We don't have, because this is a subject that comes out of this literary context, we don't have so much evidence of how it then fitted back into the liturgical cycle and the preaching cycle. The context where we see this used in a way analogous to a preaching story would be it seems to be an incident in a very long romance of what the three living did next, which is in the bas de page of the Smithfield Decretals. So the Smithfield Decretals, canon law text with lots of continuous narrative through the bas de page to help you memorize and find your way through the book. That seems to be a context where we have this is being used like an exemplum, very long, shaggy dog story of an exemplum. But we don't have a lot of evidence of this being used in preaching, it's interesting because we find it being, this exchange being referenced in tomb and brass commemoration. And I think you're certainly right that it's a warning, but it's also often associated with that idea of the generations, the idea of the father and the son, for example. Sometimes the inscriptions say, you know, our heirs are mortal, you know, these are our sons that we're talking to. So that idea that in these pictures, the dead, they're obviously, you know, we're to imagine them as being scary, but in the paintings from particularly the 14th century, the dead are benign. They're not like the Dance of Death, or in the 15th century, you get the dead turn nasty. And they become aggressive, and they're coming after the living, and they're waving their spades or their spears. In these pictures, the dead are benign, and they're there to warn the living. And often there is that idea that they are, you know, they are the ancestors of the living. So I think associating it with the time of year, that isn't so clear. Clearly, you perhaps know Kate Giles has done some very interesting work about time of year and paintings in relation to Pickering. But I think with this, it's more that general idea of warning, the previous generations warning, you know, the living to mend their ways.
That's absolutely fascinating. Mary, I know you had a question, and then we'll go.
Thank you. Maybe a little bit off the point, but I noticed your picture of St Thomas at Salisbury had quite a lot of resonance with our Doom, in particular the architectural structures.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could make some comment about that.
Yeah. Yes, I was interested in that myself because of a question which I think has been raised with your Doom, which is how many layers of paint can we see there? When we look at the area in the centre and we look at those angels and Christ in the centre, I would be, broadly happy with that being quite an elegant, perhaps later 14th century scheme. That certainly was what Tristram thought. The very round arches and architecture of heaven that we see looks a little bit later, and maybe that has been, as it were, renewed, refreshed. See, at St Thomas's, Salisbury, that whole painting was given a makeover in the 19th century. That's why it looks so fantastic and so complete. It's really helpful having paintings that look complete, as we've heard, but you do have to be a little bit suspicious of anything that looks complete. But yes, it's typical. Heaven tends to be shown, sometimes people talk about it, it's like a walled city, or it's like a castle, or it's like a college. It's any sort of building within an enclosure. And clearly many of the large cities of medieval Europe, they emulated the 12 gates of the heavenly Jerusalem. So Coventry or Cologne, all these places, they had 12 gates because they want to make their city like the city of heaven, visually and physically.
Thank you. I wonder if you might just say a word about conservation. Pardon? Yeah. I wonder if you might just say a word about conservation. I mean, given that paintings are, obviously so delicate, and sadly, I guess continue to deteriorate over time. I mean, is there any sense of a sort of national effort to, record and preserve them across the country?
Yeah. So that's a really good question about whether, what do we do with these paintings? First of all, I mean, it's possible that many of these paintings have now been exposed to view for longer in the modern age than they were during the Middle Ages. The paintings are, as you described, fragile. So the paintings that you have here, because they're painted in these earth colours, they shouldn't, as it were, fade, and the colours do not alter in the way that you've seen the lead and the vermilion blackening in some of those fancier paintings. However, the layer of paint itself is very, very thin. It's just a thin layer of paint, as if you were to go and paint in watercolour on a wall in your house. That's how thin the paint is. In that sense, it's very different from something like a fresco where you have a bonding between the surface. So had studied at the Courtauld. The department at the Courtauld came about because of things that happened in the 1980s. Now, I'm sure you all remember that, the 1980s and the changes in attitudes to funding and public service and so on, which happened in that period. So you will be familiar with the idea that for stained glass and for Romanesque sculpture and Anglo-Saxon sculpture, there are projects, these corpus projects, which have funding where you have record photography and you have the creation of volumes and you have the creation now, obviously, of websites and so on, where this material is collected, surveyed, issues around condition and conservation are considered, and the material is looked at and preserved. David Park had some seed corn funding in, I think, the early 1980s to look at doing something similar for wall paintings. And, so some work was done, Cheshire, Lancashire, working with the Royal Commission on Historic Monuments, as it then was, doing record photography and trying to work out something about the condition of the paintings. And the Department of Conservation of Wall Painting at the Courtauld came about, as I understand it, largely because, first of all, they discovered what a state these paintings were in. Because of this fragile quality that you describe, most types of preservation prior to the mid-1950s, or maybe even we might say the early 1970s, were about trying to introduce coatings to protect the paintings and keep the paintings on the wall. And these were, whether these were paraffin wax or egg or liquid nylon, these were all equally disastrous as conservation interventions. This is why wall painting conservation people are really, really boring, because most of the things that we've done in the past 150 years have been counterproductive. So they were aware of that, but also they never got the statutory funding, which, Corpus Vitriarum, Corpus Romanorum got. So there is a national survey of wall paintings in the Courtauld, which is largely a thing in filing cabinets and sets of slides, and it's being digitised at the moment. They got some Paul Mellon money to digitise it. So that is happening at the moment, and the department is a sort of clearinghouse when people find paintings. When I was there in the early to mid-1990s, paintings would turn up about, one a week, because people were rewiring their churches and cutting channels into the historic plaster. So paintings, anywhere which has got old plaster, there are paintings of some sort, and they keep turning up. So the National Survey does exist, and it has this intervention with it, but it doesn't have the same level of funding which those other surveys have had. And that's one of the reasons why with wall paintings there's a sort of joint effort between the National Survey and the work that's done with Historic England, and there are wall paintings officers for Historic England who look after the paintings, obviously both in the English Heritage. It's obviously one of the greatest holders of buildings with historic painting in, but also they look at paintings across the country. So it's a bit scattered, so that's because of it being a later addition to this approach.
If I could just add to that, because I'm on the committee for the Anglo-Saxon corpus, the sculptural corpus, and we have had to struggle year on year since the late 1960s, when it was originally set up, to get funding. It's a huge and difficult task, and that was even in those days when funding was more available. So my heart goes out to you on this, but it's such important work that's being done, and to get it all digitised and somehow available online is the goal. We're actually in the Anglo-Saxon Sculpture Corpus coming to that very late. We've had the published volumes, but digitisation is the way forward.
Yes, and digitisation is particularly good for making things available. And you've seen that some of these images you'll be familiar with. There's a whole corpus of material collected by Anne Marshall from the Open University, which the Reed Design Group have maintained and continue to make available. So that is the thing that effectively functions currently as an online searchable, searchable by site and by county and by subject.
Thank you. Miranda, I think you have a question.
You see that you have a sort of cartoon image on the screen at the moment, and somebody else spoke about the painters. Would they have worked from such an image, when they came here, for example? They would have worked from a pattern book?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, I think they would have done. They, obviously, in the 15th century, early 16th century, I think we sometimes find them as, so these woodcuts, the Dance of Death paintings in the Gill Chapel at Stratford-upon-Avon look as if they're based on these woodcuts from Paris. But because they were using a version of Lydgate's poem, so the poem that's based on the scheme in St Paul's, there's a slightly weird mismatch between those two sources. They would have used pattern books, and sometimes it might be that the patterns are perhaps provided by the patrons. Sometimes the pattern books may travel with the artists, and sometimes we can see, a workshop of artists and they're using the same models or versions of the same models. My colleague, Jo Mattingly, a great expert on medieval Cornwall, she discovered what appears to be such a fragment of such a pattern book, or maybe of a sort of inspeximus, a drawing used to seal an agreement about making paintings. She discovered this reused as a wrapper around some early modern church wardens' accounts. And that's a very nice example of the use of this model, ultimately from the Delal, the Madonna Master for the Delal Psalter, being disseminated into the middle of the 14th century. So quite an interesting piece of evidence, but clearly it's very unusual for us to find these pieces of evidence.
Well, thank you. And could I just remind everybody, when you get home, get onto our website, flamsteadheritage.org, and fill in our evaluation form so we know that you've had a wonderful evening, as I'm sure you will have. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. And thank you very much indeed, Miriam. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.